As we think about those that playbook, we can think about process improvement. We can think about technology adoption. We can think about also looking at just changing what is delivered, the actual output of a process. And so the key is, we don't just throw technology at it and hope it all works, or just work harder and hope that works too. So how do we think about that playbook? How do we think about process technology as it applies to what we need to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big pitfalls is looking at technology as the panacea for big change. I know a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the focus right now we're hearing in the news is about legacy system modernization. You've got these old systems, in some cases 40 years old. We've all heard a governor mention very highly public comments about we need programmers. So we see these legacy systems and they need to be modernized, and a lot of jurisdictions have been going down that path. And what we see, one of the pitfalls is really trying to focus on process first, because what you find is that in those projects, if you think about it, you've got these big systems, you're trying to modernize all of them, and it's not just one system, it's 20, 30, 40 intertwined systems. So when you start to modernize those, if you don't look at process first, you're really just modernizing old efficient processes with new technology. And that's really not going to get you much, and it's not a good use of your resources, dollars, or people's efforts. So you really want to look at your processes before you automate anything. And one thing you have to keep in mind is that the people that are working in these organizations in the public sector, they're experts in what they do today, experts in the as is, but they're not necessarily experts in the to be. So we have to start to get them into that mindset. And I think it's the old adage of, when you're trying to get somebody to absorb knowledge and get somebody to operate in a new way, it takes multiple passes of that. So this concept of thinking about how do we reimagine the future in our processes before we implement technology, to me takes time and has to be facilitated. But I think it's an important thing before we simply look at technology as the fix.
Yeah, as I've said many times, that if you automate a bad process, your bad process just works faster. And if your process creates outcomes that aren't what's really needed, if it creates defects, if it creates rework, then it just does more of those things. I recently had an interaction where I could do an awful lot of things online, and then I got a digital request for information, and on the form it says fax back your information, because that's the process that was designed, and that's the automated response that I now got via email.
Right.
But and then I was able to work around it, but so did the other person, right? And that means that every time they're doing this, they have to kind of send a note saying, "Oh, you can just email it," and because we haven't updated those processes. So it really is, I think, with the willingness of people to change and the need for people to change, as well as governments to change, there's an opportunity to rethink, waste in the process, an opportunity to think what actually matters to the organization. There's a great example if we look at an industry of the grocery store. 100 years ago, or 105 years ago, actually, to be more precise, you didn't go into a grocery store and pick your own groceries. An organization called Piggly Wiggly, which, depending on where people live, would be familiar with that, kind of created self-selection, where people went into the grocery store and picked stuff off their shelves. And it had impacts like it increased impulse buying, it increased the importance of packaging and branding, but at least short term and possibly longer term, that trend 100 years later is now reversed, which means maybe packaging doesn't matter as much if you're just buying a product online and picking it up at curbside. Maybe how do the buyers want to buy? When do they want to buy? And how does technology enable all of that? The point is that grocery stores may imagine their footprint, their lighting costs, their staffing costs, their value delivery, and where the overall value is in that. And that's just a public example that everyone interacts with at some level. But for each organization, for each agency, for each process, we kind of have to go through the same mental process of imagining what really is needed in this change, what else changes along with it that we can take advantage of, and then what enables it, where technology is usually the enablement rather than the first entry into the change.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. I'm thinking of the concept of what parts of the process are really sacred, if you will, or can't change. Right? In your example, if you're a grocery store and you're thinking about how do we deal with the pandemic and how do we deal with the issues around it, coming at it from a different perspective to say, well, why do we even have grocery stores the way they exist now? It is a completely foreign concept, unless you look back at history as you've done. I think it's the same in the government sector, which is we look at the interactions we have on customers on a regular, citizens on a regular basis, and we say, do we need to have those? What's the point of it? Like, what's the point of a license renewal? And I get it, I understand the point of it, but is the point really to have somebody come in and have their picture taken every time they get their license renewed every 2 years? Or is the point that we just have to verify the credential? So if we look at it that way, I think it does help us almost in a very objective way say what's really important. And as a result of what's really important, what processes do we have to now put in place or modify? So I really enjoy that example because I think it really drives it home.
Yeah, and if you take the DMV a step further, if somebody has a webcam, you can grab a screen grab of that. Maybe it's not the proper resolution, maybe it is, but could you have DMV appointments virtually, just like we have doctor's appointments and dentist appointments, at least some of them. We have now orthodontists are saying, send me a picture with the retainer in and with the retainer out, and then I'll examine if adjustments need to be made so that you don't have to come in. So we really, to get back to the core value of a process and understand what's most important, not just what we've always done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I don't want to jump ahead of what we're talking about, but one of the things that I think we're starting to move into is the concept of the customer journey. The DMV example is a great example because there are pushes now to say, why do I even need to have a license? One thing I always have with me all the time is my phone. Why can't my phone just display my verified credential that says I am a licensed driver? Gosh, my phone knows my face. It does facial recognition. Why can't I use that technology to renew it? So when we step back and look at the customer journey and think about things like we need to interact with citizens on a periodic basis to review and verify things, what do they have with them all the time? What are they normally doing? Where are they normally going to be? I think that brings in the concept of this customer journey. And when you start to look at your processes from the perspective of the customer, without a doubt, it opens up a new window to things that maybe you hadn't even expected. And I feel like from the inside, public sector organizations, everybody, all companies, no company designs a process to be complex and confusing for customers or citizens. Like that is not the plan when you're thinking about how to interact. You're just trying to make sure you hit all the requirements, especially in the public sector. There's a lot of legal requirements. So you have to make sure you do those. But when you start to, so from the inside, you might look at a process and say, we're doing this the best we can. We're as efficient as possible. We're using technology. If you step outside the organization and say, what's the customer's view? You're going to find a whole host of things that you would say, I understand why they're confused. We thought we were doing everything to educate, but in reality, they don't understand the beginning. Like Real ID is a perfect example. And I'm not ashamed to admit, Real ID confuses me. And I work with DMVs, so I know what it's supposed to be. And I look at the materials that come out and I look at the steps I have to take and what I have to do. And I'm like, I totally understand that there's a disconnect. And being on the inside and trying to do your best based on the legal requirements and regulations, I get it. But I'm also looking at it from a customer standpoint. So I think customer journey is a really powerful perspective when you look at what am I going to change and how am I looking to change?